Hello, I am Dr. Lynn Piwa-Warzik, Director of the Boston Center for Refugee Health and Human Rights in Boston, Mass., USA. As former president of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs in the United States, for many years we were focused on developing a network of programs to serve the needs of asylum seekers and refugees coming to the U.S. Becoming individual members of IRCT, our views were opened to the work of programs in many parts of the world and the challenges they face. More importantly, we recognized ourselves as part of a global movement. Then to participate in 2016 in Mexico City with IRCT programs worldwide, we contributed to the drafting and approval of the Mexico Global Consensus, establishing worldwide standards for this work. At this time, as autocratic governments and behaviors have taken center stage, it is extraordinarily important to have a single voice, a single global voice, advocating health-based rehabilitation of torture survivors and their improved quality of life. Especially as governments have hidden behind COVID to oppress opposition, our unified voice fighting for human rights and the care and protection of torture survivors must continue to drown out the sum of their individual voices and actions. To work in concert with similar goals and objectives worldwide reminds us that what happens in one part of the world intimately affects all of us. On behalf of the Boston Center for Refugee Health and Human Rights, we are grateful to the leadership of IRCT as we navigate these perilous times. Thank you.
Data in the fight against torture. I think it can be a blessing and a curse. It can be a blessing when it's done well, because the first question anyone who wants to understand torture or who needs to be responsible for it asks is it still happening? Where is it happening? Who's doing it? How many people are suffering it? Where have they come from? How old are they? We need all that data. But it can also be a curse in that it might get in the way of treatment. If the doctor is overwhelmed, it might get lost, it might get corrupted, it might get stolen, and therefore pose a security risk. So you need to be very careful with data. And first, you've got to be very smart about the way you collect it. And then second, be very smart about the way you interpret it.
The stories that torture survivors narrate about their experiences help their families and communities understand what they've been through. Having global data helps national and international institutions understand the problem and the need to address it.
I think data can very much help because it provides an evidence base from which we can carry out our work. And that helps drive legitimacy and credibility into our partners, but also helps us make stronger arguments for when we need to convince decision makers to take action. So certainly in the case of documenting violations, it can be very helpful, but also in the advocacy that we carry out. It is very useful to us because for many decision makers and for many policymakers, data can serve as a useful evidence base, basically. And that includes in Geneva, where it's not just that we don't have to convince those people, but for them, it's a useful tool for them when they make recommendations to states. So if their recommendations are backed by solid facts and solid data, then they have an easier time in making those recommendations, or it's much harder for states to deny violations if it's backed by data. I mean, yeah.
So for me, in the global fight against torture, the personal stories are the most important. So we want to know what a survivor thinks of the rehabilitation, what's happened to them. We want to tell their story. But for many people in this world, an anecdote needs to be backed up by some data. It needs to be backed up by numbers. It gives, for some reason, a credibility behind the personal stories. So the combination for IRCT of member centers who report in and give us this data tells us the numbers, and it tells a good part of the story in numbers that for some is the credibility marker of this organization. But we will always combine the data that's collected and the numbers with the human story. And that, I think, makes the most convincing argument on how we can eradicate torture in this world.